Well, good morning.
Good morning,
David,
to you.
thanks for coming. At relatively short notice today.
Yeah, it's nice to be a stand-in, isn't it?
I know.
I don't know what it says about me that I'm available.
It's just
within
that you
12
weren't
hours
the CFO.
notice. Yeah,
But
I'm not your typical guest.
you're not a typical guest,
No.
but you are an experienced speaker.
I am somewhat, yeah. I've done this a few times
Yeah.
now in the last year. And I like it, right? I mean, we've known each other for years. You know, more running into each other at gigs actually than to do with work. But I think you kind of, I started last year in a position where I was about to take redundancy from a very, very big role in a very, very big company. And I kind of said, you know what, that's the year of yes. So I just started saying yes to stuff. So I've just come here now from a breakfast that I was invited to that I kind of said yes to. After I leave here, I'm then going to a meeting that kind of came from me saying yes to having a chat with a guy about something which may become a future company. But you kind of go, if you don't say yes and you don't turn up to stuff, then you never know what's going to happen.
That's funny. My New Year's resolution was to say no to stuff.
I'll say no to more stuff.
But
I'm
anyway,
more pessimistic this year. I'm going to say no. Love it.
Do you give us an intro, David, please?
Okay. David Brammer, typically known as a TA director or head of TA, worked for, most recently I was on contract with Dyson. But before that, I've done work with Kantar Public, loads of work in the retail and e-com space with Kingfisher Group, Ocado. I was TA director for Ocado, and, you know, TK Maxx, Boots. But before that, I've been in recruitment for basically 23 years. And I started on the agency kind of side, mostly with kind of Ministry of Defence type contracts and security cleared stuff. And then moved in-house about 2006, 2007. And since then, just kind of worked my way up through the ranks. But these days, I kind of brand myself more as a leadership consultant. So I kind of go from company to company, helping them with their employee and employment proposition and their brand and, you know, their go-to-market strategies and how they attract talent. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
What do you love about it? Why do you get out of bed every day still?
I think love's a strong word. What I love about it is that I'm good at it, and I think you can grow to love things that you're just good at. My experience with getting into recruitment was probably the same as you guys, right? No one went to the school counselor and said, you know what I want to be when I'm older? I really want to be a recruiter, because it just wasn't a thing, you know? And I'm showing my age because I'm 44, almost 45. And when you left school back in the day, you know, there weren't really apprenticeships and stuff to speak of, and there weren't a load of choices. You either went out and worked or you went to uni. I went out and worked and then went to uni at night because I wanted the money, but I also wanted the qualifications. So I'm kind of a opportunist.
Yeah.
And I fell into recruitment, but I found that I enjoyed it mostly because I love it.
Yeah.
Being good at something, you know, and I was good at it.
And we both failed at being rock stars.
We both failed at being rock stars. Yeah. Yeah. At a similar time as well, right? Because we were touring with like editors and athlete and delays and bands at a similar time that you were out there and you were doing your stuff with kids in glass houses and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
Long while back now, but yeah, I think a lot of creatives are in recruitment. A lot of creatives do what I do. It's a nice, you kind of more typically, if you are a creative, I think in my experience of knowing a lot of creatives, they tend to be quite people. And if you are people and you're good at conversing, then recruitment actually is a pretty good career path for you.
Yeah.
Because it is just chatting.
And I guess there's that element of being creative lends itself to sort of your role now being very strategic,
Absolutely, yeah.
much less in the detail. I guess it's hard to get there, but
It is, and it's a big departure because when you're used to kind of working in a big organization like an Ocado or like a Kingfisher Group, where you're responsible not only for the strategic element of it and the creative element of how do you engage an audience, how do you stay relevant, you're also then managing the budget side of things. You're managing the team side of things and, you know, performance management and everything else. When you're just going in as a leadership consultant to a company, it's a good thing in a sense that you're there just because of your experience and to be that creative and to be that person who says, here's the art of the possible, here's what you can do, here's what you could possibly achieve if you went down this route. But it can also conversely be a bit more on the lonely spectrum just because by nature of the work that you're doing, people are often quite skeptical of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Right? It's like being the management consultant. How popular are management consultants? Not particularly popular, because they typically go into companies, rip them up and kind of go, well, that doesn't work. Those people don't do a great job. Start again, lose those people, do this, do that. Broad generalization of what a management consultant does. But in principle, you're not really there to make friends. But then obviously you're paid a premium to be there for a short time, do a specific job. Maybe it is a bit lonely, but you learn loads more stuff and you do more creative things. So it works for me anyway.
Do you find it hard though that now historically you'd have seen the strategy through? So there's a lot more headaches, but now you're just going in and providing a strategy and then buggering off and letting someone else implement it.
Yeah, that is harder because you don't kind of get to see through to fruition the plans and the concepts and the construct that you've initiated. So I think that is tougher, because when you are in an in-house type of role, if you're a TA director for a major FTSE 50, as I have been for a couple, then you're there to execute against it, but also to see how well it worked. When it fails, you learn from it. Actually, in a consulting capacity, you can go into a company, you can do a bit of a diagnostic on an advisory kind of level and say, right, well, I'm going to rip this apart, I'm going to learn about it, and then I'm going to come back to you with some insights. And I'm going to give you a impartial third-party view on how you could amend this and make things better. And you can give them a plan. Doesn't also mean that the company's always going to run with it.
Yeah.
This is the thing. I've done consulting gigs where I've gone into a company and said, right, so fundamentally, this bit works, don't touch it. Fundamentally, this bit doesn't work, you need to touch it, and they will still do the opposite. Because in certain instances with consulting gigs, people don't want sometimes to hear what you've got to say. And that's tough. Because then you kind of go, well, am I just becoming some kind of mercenary that takes the highest day rate that I can get to tell people stuff that they don't really want to hear and they might not actually action anyway. But for me, it's still fulfilling because you still learn. Whichever gig you do, however big a company is, whatever the nature of the work you're doing, it's still really interesting.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You're always going to take something. You're always going to learn something from whatever company it is. Company of 5 people, company of 500,000 people, like a TK Maxx or whatever, right? When you've worked for a company like that, that's so huge. It's like a megalodon of a business.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to learn different things. But then I worked for Mind Gym, and Mind Gym was a couple of hundred people. The lessons with that were entirely different, but equally as valuable.
What are the big mistakes you see companies still making in 2024 at the executive hiring level?
Exec hiring. I think whether they're mistakes or not, I think a number of companies fail to define across the board what it is that they're looking for still from specific hires. So if you think about a CEO of a business that you're working for, and they're saying, right, I need to go out and I need to find a CFO. Each of the other board members are going to want to work alongside and need to work alongside that CFO, and they need to have a successful relationship, and they'll all have a different view as to what that CFO needs to achieve and where the other existing CFO kind of fell short, right? So if you just rely on what the CEO is telling you as a search provider or as the custodian of a search process, right, where you're engaging either a Shrek firm or a second tier, third tier firm, often that's where it falls down, because you're going to meet the expectation of the CEO, but not only is the CEO pivotal in the process, but they're also not the only person that is in the process, right? They're going to meet the rest of the C-suite, and that's where things tend to fall down because CEOs don't tend to align with their team on what it is that they're looking for. So you as a search firm can do a great job on a CFO from a CEO's perspective, but then actually everybody else can just kind of kibosh that and just kind of go, well, actually, I've got some concerns about this. I've got concerns about that because, you know, the engagement didn't happen up front. I think that's pitfall number one from an exec standpoint in my personal experience. Number two is, I think the mistake of you have to use a Shrek firm if it's a C-suite role. And that is typically my experience, right? With the big companies that I've worked for, they are reluctant to work with second tier or third tier firms because they believe for some reason that they don't have the reach, they don't have the equity in the market to be taken seriously.
And you don't get fired for hiring a Shrek firm?
Well,
if you're a CEO, CFO, the old adage,
yeah.
You don't get fired for hiring PwC. You don't get fired for hiring Accenture. Is it the same for a Shrek firm in larger organizations?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are personal relationships, and that's always been the case, right? So when I was working for, I won't name names of the company, right? But when I was working for one of my big retail companies that I worked for, of which there were a series, they had a really great relationship with one of the Shrek firms. That relationship with the Shrek firm was actually predicated on the relationship with an individual within that Shrek firm. So the equity actually wasn't with the Shrek firm. The equity was with the individual. The IP was the individual. The IP wasn't the Shrek firm. It is the reassurance of working with the Shrek firm because a number of the C-suite people that you're working with have been placed traditionally, right? By the Russell Reynolds, the Heydrichs, whoever it is. And therefore they've got existing relationships, and everybody has a converse view as to who they should use, right? So if the CFO was last placed by Korn Ferry or the CEO, has got a great relationship with Russell Reynolds or Heydrich or Spencer Stewart, whoever it is, that's their preference and they will put that forward. So it doesn't really matter in a number of instances as the TA leader and advisor, on the exec hiring, whether you say, well, actually, from a finance point of view, you should consider using a second or a third tier firm. And actually, if you're really looking to positively steer D&I, there are a couple of companies who really over-index on that, and they will really push, a really diverse kind of long list, and then, what have you. Oftentimes, that kind of falls a little bit on deaf ears because the relationships are so strong and the IP of the individual within the company is so strong that that's where the work goes. But it does go to the individual, I think, rather than to the firm. Yeah. And that's the key. And this is what I always kind of say when I'm working with any exec agency or contingent or retained agency kind of scenario. It doesn't really matter the limited company that's involved. It's always down to the individual. We met when you were with Vitae, right? Your equity with me was built while you were with Vitae, and some years later now, I brought you in when we were doing some exec search stuff at Mind Gym when I was there, and I can then subsequently introduce you to, Ocado when I'm there, or, Dyson or whoever it is. But that is built not necessarily on the IP of Stoics. It is built on the IP of Neil French, and that's a sustained kind of relationship that we've had for a number of years, and that's been mutually beneficial, right? But it is based on the individual, and I don't think a lot of people recognize that. I think, some companies will definitely. I've worked for founders who will only work with Shrek firms because it's an ego trip for them to an extent to kind of say, oh, well, we should call blah, 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 wherever. And I think it's a bit sad, really, because wouldn't you rather work with the exec search firm who are inch wide and mile deep rather than mile wide and inch deep on every industry and on every market? There are 2 or 3 companies that I would specifically go and work with because I know that their sales exec search team are exceptional. There are people that I would work with, like a Stoics, for example, who I would work with from a financial search point of view. I wouldn't necessarily call you about business development search in the same way that I wouldn't call the business development search firm about a finance assignment for a CFO. But when you're working with the Shrek firms, as valuable as they are and as wonderful as they are, and I've had exceptionally good experiences working with them on certain things and not so good on others, I think it's always a balance.
Yeah.
The IP of the individual is always at the fore. That's always what is important.
How do you think the landscape's changing? Because obviously you defined it in Shrek, tier 2, tier 3. Feels like Premier League, Championship, Division 1, maybe.
I guess defined more by scale than it is, credibility. Yeah, of course.
But
right?
Do you think there's this opportunity for disruption, progression between the tiers? Do you think the Shrek will exist in its current form, or do you think other people may come to play in that market in the future? Yeah, I'm just interested to know your overview.
I think there's always a place for all of those different tiers of exec search firm. The big companies, the Fortune 500s of the world, are probably, for their C-suite, always going to use the Shrek firms. That's just a truth. It's a reality. It's how things have existed for many a decade, and it's probably not going to change. I think some of the smaller, more boutique startup, scale-up, Series A, Series B type firms that need to use exec search firms are much more open now to slightly less binary relationships. And what I mean by that is I've seen a huge evolution in just the last 10 years from an exec search standpoint, where I will use a specific company. If I can't afford a full search with them and I don't have the budget for it, I will just pay them for the research. They'll go out to the market for me in their proposition just to pay for the research, which is essentially the first third of the 3/3, right? They will go out, they'll qualify the market, they'll identify the talent, and they'll hand over the list of X number of people. And then it's down to me and or my exec recruiter to manage that. And I think that's really a positive thing. I think it's a really positive thing because sometimes you don't want to get tied into a 90 to 250K search that you can't get out of. I worked for one founder at one point, and you know them, and I won't say who it was, but I worked for one founder at one point who abandoned more searches than we completed in 1 year. We abandoned like £500,000 worth of searches that we started and then just fell out of love with the individuals or the process or whatever. And actually, in some of those instances, we didn't end up using a firm at all. It ended up being a recommendation or a referral, which you should always execute those kind of things first, right? It's what's the most common problem that agencies have? Well, we're working on this role and it's contingent and we've worked on it for 6 weeks and we've put loads of hours into it and they've gone with an internal candidate. That should never happen. That's poor management internally from that client. There should never be a scenario where, or I guess at least if that does happen, right, everyone should be on the same page. Do you know what I mean? So like if you're going to use a firm to try and help you to make a hire or to find someone, if there are internal people in the mix, let that firm manage the internal candidates as well as the external candidates and let them manage the process. But if you're, forgive the term, but if you're stupid enough as a supplier to go into a company and work on a contingency basis for something of such high value, when you're going up against potentially internal candidates and or other vendors, then that's naivety on your part. Right?
We've all learned that the hard way.
I think everybody's probably been there and they've all learned that lesson, right? But it's a hard lesson that a lot of people still haven't learned. And I was talking to a good friend of mine the other day who, you know, she works in the marketing space. And she worked for me at one firm. She now has her own kind of search practice. And she only works in the marketing space, only with creatives. It's not a particularly well-paid industry, right? It's not right up there in terms of salaries, and therefore the fees aren't huge. But I kind of said to her, well, how was last year? She's like, amazing. I said, yeah, but anybody could probably make money last year because it was a boom last year, right? You didn't have to be a particularly credible or brilliant company or individual to make money. The market was there. You could turn business away, and people did, right? I said, but what about this year? She said, well, I'm just going up constantly on contingency basis against X, Y, and Z companies. I said, well, then why are you doing contingency? Why aren't you saying to those companies, I will dedicate my time and I will use my network, but you have to pay me a small upfront retainer, even if it's $1,000 or something, right? Just to make sure that my time isn't lost. And that's then deductible if I then place someone for you. But if I place no one for you and I put in 6 to 8 weeks worth of work and hours of my time, what, I just do that for free? Yeah. Hell no. I like, people often say to me, because obviously I've worked in-house now for years and years, obviously I was in agency previously, I only worked on exclusive stuff 20 years ago. I wouldn't go up against other companies. Why would I waste my time? I value my time too much and I value my expertise too much to go up against people on the off chance that I might place someone and I might make a 20 grand fee or a 30 grand fee. No, absolutely not. So in these instances, I think contingency almost needs to change for the benefit of the individuals and for their brand and for their, IP to evolve to, well, actually, I don't give my time away for free. In the same way that the search firms don't. The search firms don't give you, their long list on the basis that you might then choose someone from the long list, right? They give you the long list as a result of you paying them for their first third of their fee. So I don't know. I feel like that the contingent market will always be there. I think there are lots of people in the contingent market who try to work on a contingency basis in the retained market and in the exec search market. And I think there will always be companies that will go for that, because if you're an internal TA director and someone's offering you something for free, are you the mug for turning it down, or are they the mug for offering it, right? Probably a bit of both. But I think that the contingent world is probably going to change a little bit in the coming years. And certainly for the more discerning kind of agency directors out there, you don't take on the contingent work without at least some kind of a retainer up front that says, okay, well, we're going to dedicate a consultant for 3 days of their time. We're going to charge that at, £1,000 for those 3 days. That £1,000 is then deductible against your fee.
Yeah.
Do you think as well that this seems to be this shift from kind of time to hire, cost of hire, towards more qualitative metrics, how long people stay, etc. And so in a way, the market is, as TA evolves in-house, it kind of lends itself towards more of a retained search proposition at whatever level, because instead of just taking the applicants from adverts, instead of just taking a few messages that have gone out on LinkedIn, you're kind of demanding that your suppliers go and get you the best available talent on the market, rather than just, here's a transaction, I'm going to throw some CVs at you. So there seems to be that shift in-house that maybe will lend itself.
Yeah. And I think also in-house, the proposition is evolving too, in a sense that I'm seeing more roles being kind of brought my way by companies who are saying, we're looking to try and replace some of that external cost on the exec hiring, not necessarily at the C-suite. I don't think that the C-suite hiring will ever move away from search firms. I'll go on record and say that quite comfortably, quite happily, right? But at the C-suite -1 or C-suite -2 type level, actually, more companies now are trying to kind of build up their proposition and their offer, and kind of saying, right, well, how much of that can we do internally? And so many different firms now, certainly the FTSE 250s, have got their own internal search teams. And those search teams have got research teams. And those research teams are starting to do the talent benchmarking and the mapping that was only really possible previously for the bigger search firms, right? So if you think about LinkedIn Talent Intelligence and what they can offer you these days, or what you can do with like a Horsefly or a platform like that, they can help you really to do all of that research bit. The only question that I have when it gets to that C-suite -1 type level is, you have to have someone who is almost an ex-Shrek firm or tier 1, tier 2 search partner from a business coming into that team to be able to hold a credible conversation. Because what you can't do, with the greatest of respect to any in-house recruiter, is you can't just say to them, well, actually, today you're doing finance managers at 55, 65K. Tomorrow, actually, we need you to look at a sales director and their basic's going to be 250K, and you need them to have full coverage of the US and Latin America and blah, blah, blah. It just doesn't, the skill sets are very different. It doesn't mean that those people aren't capable of that. They are, with the right development and training. But for the credibility of those conversations at that level, it's very hard to do that without bringing in the expertise of someone who used to be a partner.
And judgment as well, I guess. It's not just the credibility, but
critical judgment. Yeah, I think so. So I'm coached right now by an ex-Shrek firm search partner. And she's wonderful. And she worked in-house after a series of different years of working for the search firms, and just understands things and the level at which she converses and understands how to hold the right level of conversation with people. That dictates, I think, very much how much influence she has with the board when they're hiring their -1s, right? It takes a lot of trust, because you don't want to dent your brand equity or your brand perception by having someone who can't hold the right conversation at the right level. It's going to be super damaging if you're then reaching out to C-suite -1 type candidates and giving them a poor experience and not really able to articulate what the proposition is. Because those people, they have different questions.
Yep.
You're hiring a finance manager at, let's say, 65K. The questions and the conversation that individual wants to have with you are 2-3 layers down. They're in the micro rather than in the macro. When you're starting to talk about a director or a senior director, they want to talk about, they expect you to know the EBIT, right? They expect you to know what's happening in terms of the markets, different moves, competitors, that kind of stuff. If you don't know that, your credibility is almost immediately diminished. So I think that the internal capability bit is increasing. I think it's getting better. It's great. It's an evolution. I don't think many companies are there yet. I think, the big fours and the major finance institutions, some of the FTSE 250 maybe are starting to kind of broach into that. But for the time being, I think C-suite, certainly in C-suite -1 or -2 is still very much Shrek territory or tier 2, tier 3.
What do you think about, we keep coming across this thing of culture fit and culture add. And at the C-suite level, often I want a CFO.
Yeah.
It looks like this to fill this gap, but not necessarily taking into account the attributes of the wider C-suite and what might be needed to add to it, as opposed to putting a square peg in a circle. And also off the back of that, where does psychometrics sit for you these days?
So I'll answer those in reverse order. So I've always been a fan of psychometrics. I did my kind of BPS kind of qualifications with that stuff back in like 2007. I didn't understand it before that. As soon as you understand it and how they should be used and how they should be employed in a process to influence the process rather than being employed in the process as an automatic kind of killer stage, if you know what I mean. Like an OPQ should never be utilized as oh no, that person's preferences, they're just not going to work for us. Off you trot. That's not how it should work. If you've got the right psychometrics in place and you're using them consistently, I think it's incredibly valuable. So when I worked for TJX Europe, they were the business for me personally that nailed it. So they had at what they called AVP level, which would, I guess, map market-wise to like a head of or a director of elsewhere, right? At that AVP level, they had like a half-day assessment with a business psychologist, right, who would sit with you as an individual to take you through that assessment. You would do an element of verbal and numerical because they wanted to get a grasp of IQ as much as they did EQ, right? But you go through a series of different assessments and they would utilize like OPQs or equivalents, and they'd invest in those people. If you got to that stage, you were pretty much there or thereabouts, right? Because that day cost that company thousands. Just for that one individual, it cost them thousands to put them through that process. But they knew it. And they knew it was an absolute guarantee of success because they'd worked with the same firm doing those same assessments for years, and it had been proven, tried, tested. So I think the problem with assessments, and certainly with OPQs, is with most companies, in my experience, they don't use it consistently. It's like, I think we'll interview them next week. Just throw them out an OPQ first. Really? You don't want to meet them first and perhaps make some assumptions that could then be, backed up by the OPQ, and then maybe you then use that to influence the outcomes of your third stage or your fourth stage.
Maybe slightly better experience for the candidate.
Well, it's a better experience for the candidate as well, right? I mean, if you're going to go for any role that, let's call exec anything 150K plus, right? By any other measure, because you can be a director or you can be a CEO of a company of one employee, right? So let's do it in financial terms. Let's say anything that's above 150K is what we might call executive, or you might go into a search process for. With those individuals, they're going to get turned off super, super quickly if the engagement isn't super, super high. And what I mean by engagement is they expect to know more about the organization. They almost expect like a candidate pack. Back in the day, if you were going for a decent sized job, companies would create a candidate pack and there'd be a profile in there about who the boss was, where they came from, what their MO was and how they worked and what they'd done in other companies and where the company was right now and where it was going to. It was almost like a kind of a 10-page booklet on a job, like you were buying a listing from Savills.
Is that not our job though now?
Well,
As part of our piece?
Well, I think it kind of is. But these days, I think it's evolved from it being a kind of a paper document, which you would have nicely printed, you know, a really creative kind of printing shop who would make it look super, super grandiose. And now it's more of a digital kind of proposition that kind of, you know, it's a fact file. It's a
strategy, vision, org structure.
Yeah. It can almost be a microsite type scenario, or it could be, you know, something that you kind of send out through an app or whatever. But I think the engagement looks different. So a candidate at that exec level, if you just start, you know, sending them an arbitrary assessment before they've even come in and had a conversation with you about something, if I'm that exec candidate, which I have been, I'm walking away from that company immediately, because that's a huge red flag. Like, have a conversation with me first. Let's establish if there's A, some kind of synergy, B, some kind of rapport, if there's a basic level of interest before you start sending me an assessment. I got a call about a job the other week. And it was to go and work with a PE firm and helping all the different PE firms with their TA and their solutions and their strategies and stuff, which might sound really interesting and really cool. And I think it probably is. But you're working for a multitude of different companies who are at a multitude of different levels and, you know, points in their journey. They had openly 8 stages in their process, which was an immediate turn off. But also they had one stage in their process where there was an assessment which had been designed, which asked you a series of questions. And the recruiter was priming me for this. And this never happened, by the way, for full disclosure. I never went through the process. But they had said to me before the process started, there is a questionnaire. It's quite probing. It's quite personal. I said, tell me more. They said, well, it asks questions like, are your parents separated? If so, at what age? At what age were you when your parents separated? Have you been promiscuous? Have you? Yeah, like seriously, this shit actually happened. Yeah. And
That's a
this,
good one.
No, seriously. And I said, no, honestly, you're having me on. And
No,
they were like, no,
promiscuous.
we're not having you on. We're not having you on. A couple of people have actually kind of fallen out of the process because of this assessment, because they found it too invasive. And I was like, well, what's it asking? It's like, well, you know, have you ever stepped out on your relationship? Have you always been monogamous? You know, have you ever broken the law? You know, how many units of alcohol do you drink a week? Have you ever taken recreational drugs? I was like, you are taking the piss. Like, seriously, no one is asking me these questions before seriously taking a job. And they said, yeah. They were like, this company utilizes this at a later stage in their process. I'm going to have to take their word that it's true, right? That it's gospel, because I didn't go through it. And I kind of withdrew before it happened. Because obviously on the basis of that conversation and others, it just didn't sound like it was my cup of tea. But that kind of shit happens. Yeah. And you can't just arbitrarily start asking people in a process, especially if they're exec candidates. You can't start asking them, you know, what's your sexual preference? Do you like dudes or do you like girls? Or, you know, no. That A, none of your business. B, far too intrusive. Yeah. C, how professional is that? Yeah. Like, not particularly. So long-winded answer to the assessment question. I'm a big fan of an OPQ if used correctly and if used consistently as a measure and as an indicator of, well, actually from the outputs of that, having someone interpret that and then tailor some really specific questions to drill into some preferences, because that's what an OPQ is really about, right? It's not saying I like working and doing repetitive tasks. It's basically saying, well, my preference for that is low or my preference for that is high. I enjoy it or I don't. Doesn't mean I can or can't do it. So it's an indicator. It always kind of builds towards a question. And then, so I guess that's the answer to the assessment question. The first question was...
Culture add, culture fit.
Culture add, culture fit. There's a big evolution this year, and you're going to hear this phrase a lot this year, and it's skills-based hiring, right? Culture fit in my personal experience, having worked for a number of the companies that I have, has often been the biggest cop-out that a company can use to just basically say, we're not going to hire that person because actually we just don't really like them.
Yeah. Yeah,
right? And most companies won't turn down a candidate and kind of say, well, we'll turn them down because honestly, we think they're going to piss people off.
Yeah.
We think that their communication style is a little bit harsh, or we just struggle to warm to them in the process, because you don't want to be rude. You don't want to be mean to people when you're giving feedback, right? So you either divert to the standards of, we found a candidate who was just that little bit better than you or more suitable than you, or you go down the route of, we didn't think it was probably quite the cultural fit that we needed it to be. Thought your experience was great, but there were others who we just thought matched, our energy.
Do you not do people deserve the truth in feedback to help them on their journey in the future?
I think it depends on which stage and whether they ask for it, right? So I've seen companies who've gone down the kind of route of, we will give feedback and we're going to call you and we're going to give you some feedback. Actually, in most instances, you can kind of actually just call a candidate if they're at first or second stage and say, do you know what? We're going to pursue other candidates. Thank you for your time. Mm-hmm. And at that stage, it's up to the candidate to then say, well, can you give me some feedback? Can you share that with me, right? What you don't necessarily want to do is make the assumption that the candidate wants to hear it. So I got called once about a role that I'd gone for, and it was, it was a big, what you would call exec role, right? And it got to the first stage, to the end of the first stage, and I'd had a conversation with the hiring manager. And this guy literally rated himself so much. He spent 45 minutes of our hour together telling me about his academic history and which university he'd gone to and how brilliant he was and how he'd worked his way up through his career into this job and that job and whatever. And now here he was, the CPO of this amazing company. And I was kind of like, yeah, we've got 15 minutes. Do you want to ask me anything? And so it kind of got to the end of the interview and I called the recruiter and I said, yeah, it's not for me. And she was kind of like, well, why not? I said, well, two reasons really. One, I can't see myself working for someone who's quite so egocentric because, wow, I mean, this guy was special. Like, literally flexing in the meeting, telling me about how much he goes to the gym. And I'm like, honestly, really, you're a CPO of a firm. And I kind of said, it was a complete mismatch. I'm sure it's a wonderful job. I'm sure it's an amazing company. But as an individual, what he brings to the table and what I bring to the table are so conflicting that for me personally, it's not going to work. And she was like, well, I actually got some feedback from him. I was like, I'm going to be really honest. I don't want to hear it because I don't know what level of feedback he could possibly give on the 15 minutes of one question that he actually asked me in that interview, quote unquote. I said, so I don't really need to hear that feedback. And that's not because I'm egocentric. It's because actually what purpose does it serve? I don't feel like I'm going to learn a lot from that feedback. I feel like whether it's positive or negative, and it turned out it was positive, even though I didn't ask for it, I have to ask for it in the first place as the candidate. And I think you should always make the assumption that actually the candidate may or may not want it, but you don't make the assumption that they do. Don't make the assumption that they don't, but don't make the assumption that they do, and kind of say, do you know what? They're going to pursue other candidates. If you're 3-4 stages deep into a conversation with a company, I'd be very surprised if people didn't want some detailed feedback, right? But if you're at first stage and you just recognize that culturally, right, you're not a fit or it wasn't a match, don't make the assumption that someone wants to hear all the reasons why they shouldn't get a job. Just let them know that it's not going to move forward and offer them the opportunity and say, do you want the feedback?
I think the feedback was probably that you're just a great listener.
Yeah. The guy thought you'd make a great therapist, But yeah, no, that was the weirdest interview. One of the weirdest interviews I've ever had. The guy was literally kind of telling me, I'm really athletic and,
Neil does that. Neil does that to me all the time.
I've been on meetings with Neil where he's literally kind of sat there and just started curling in front of you. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. I know his full gym routine as well.
Yeah, no. We have often talked about the guitars on the wall in the background.
I know.
If you've done meetings from home, and we'll talk about guitars and stuff.
Yeah.
And that's kind of natural, right? If that happens in a conversation and you're talking to someone and they're at home and there's stuff on the wall in the background, I used to work for a CPO called Ali. And Ali had this magnificent kind of massive picture behind her when she was on this call. and it was of a cycle, someone cycling, and I loved it. I just thought it was the coolest thing ever. You know, that started off a bit of a conversation for she and I, but like, if you're just on a call and you're doing an interview with someone and you're just in a white room wearing a white shirt and you start flexing, it's a little bit weird. Right?
Sorry, I won't do it again. Skills-based hiring. So what does that mean for people?
I think skills-based hiring is companies recognizing that it's more than just your experience, right? So it's how you've developed skill in different roles over different years, and how you can bring that to the fore, and you can match the skill requirements of a job versus the skill attributes of an individual and what they have and what they can bring to the table. A lot of stuff in a hiring process is kind of subjective. And also, like I said to you before, I could say that I was a CEO of a company, and in fact I am. I have a tech company, and you know, at Companies House it says that I'm the chief executive officer. I am, however, also the chief executive officer of a business of one employee, of which I am he, right? So it can say on a CV that I'm a CEO. I could then go into an interview and say, well, I was the CEO of this company, and this company did this and it does that, and you know, blah, blah, blah. And I've been there for 2 years and it's going great guns. The reality is I can't disprove that as an employer or a prospective employer of that individual, because that individual is the CEO. Conversely, if I'm interviewing someone else who is actually a CEO of a business of 90 people and a turnover of 3 or 4 million, it's a very different prospect. But comparatively on CVs, when you're applying for a job, you don't necessarily always have that context. And so I think what skills-based hiring looks to do is it looks to kind of eradicate some of that kind of storytelling bit and actually focus just a little bit more in on what we really need from this role is X, Y, and Z. You bring A, B, and C. Let's demonstrate where you've done that. So if you look at platforms like Eightfold AI, for example, they're kind of going into all the different areas of skill. And there are hundreds. You know, we're not just talking about 10 or 20 skills that you can have and be endorsed for on LinkedIn, right? Recruiting, tick, right? You're talking about influencing, but influencing up, influencing down, you know, sideways, hundreds of different ways of just talking about influence, and how you've demonstrated that and how you've learned that and how you can bring that to the table and how important that is when you're hiring a role. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about skills-based hiring this year. How companies go about that and how they assess for skills-based hires is still somewhat in development. It's in early stages, right? It's kind of like hiring someone on a values basis. Your values can be in line with that of a company, and I believe that your values should always probably be in line with whichever company you're looking to go and work for or with. But because your values are somewhat different or entirely different, it doesn't mean that you couldn't be entirely productive in that role or in that company, right? And there are lots of companies that say, well, it takes all sorts. I went through 7 stages of a hiring process last year for a TA director. I would argue top 5 biggest TA director jobs in the country, if not in Europe, last year. And I went through 7 stages. At the first stage, I said to them, I don't have this specific industry background. And they said to me, we're not looking for someone with that industry background. We're looking to diversify thought. We're looking to bring in different, you know, ethos and different values and, you know, a different way of doing things. We want to look at things differently. I was like, cool. Because I never thought I was your company's type of people. And I'm not going to say who it was, obviously. But maybe I am. And I then went through a stage after stage after stage, and it literally added up to like 30 hours worth of interviews or something like that. It was madness in the end. And I got to the final stage, and it was with a couple of partners, and the feedback comes back, yeah, you're just not got enough industry experience.
God.
And I was like, really?
Yeah.
Really? We've just wasted all of that time. I've wasted my time. You've wasted my time. But more importantly as well, I've wasted your time. Because actually what you thought you wanted at this level, when I was engaged by these people here, is very, very different to the reality of what you actually want when it comes to this level here. And that partner interview at the final stage was just a complete waste of time and a total whitewash. And I'd wasted hours and hours of my life. In the end, I'm really glad that I didn't go there, right? Because they weren't ready for change in the way that they said they were. And I stood by the reasons why I'd always said I wasn't their type of people, because I believe that industry not to be too creative in their thought, in their mindset, in how they do stuff. And I was just proven right. It took 30 hours to prove it right. And it was a bit of a waste of time, but I learned a lot from it. And I'm very glad I didn't end up nailing it and getting the job. Imagine, that would have just been purgatory.
It's a weekly occurrence, though, isn't it? For many professionals, that very story, I think, still now.
Oh, God,
despite this, skills-based hiring, job spec comes out, must have 15 years retail experience.
Oh,
must have.
The industry stuff.
Yeah.
So the industry stuff is relevant, right? In the same way that a degree is relevant. I put up a post on LinkedIn last week, and it kind of said 2 candidates, both with the same level of experience in industry, at the same level, both go for an interview. One's a graduate, one isn't. But the company don't know which the graduate is, who gets the job. And the truth of the outcome of that should be the one who they feel fits the role the best, irrespective of their academic background, because academia and intelligence aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? So you can be in ungodly levels of intellectual and intelligent, but may just chosen not to go down that path. If a company is then excluding you on the basis that you don't have a degree, that's like super narrow-minded, right? And I think it works in the same way when it comes to industry experience. So in the same way that I would expect most major retailers or e-commerce companies, because that's largely my background, I would expect them to think of me and think, oh, well, actually, that's some transferable skill. There's a lot of context there. There's a lot of knowledge. I would equally expect them not to rule out people from other backgrounds, So I don't know. I do and I don't subscribe to it. I think there may well be benefits and there can be facets and skills that people have that they can bring to a table because of their experience and because of the industries they've worked in. But I think to limit it only to those people is somewhat naive and a little bit
Do you think, though, if you're in a process, let's put you into this thing and someone comes to you and say, right, it's a chief talent role for a construction company. Yeah. So I guess
which happened a few months ago.
So my view on that, maybe it's different in talent to a CFO, but it must impact on this especially if we're talking about a skills-based assessment. Well, of course, a retail CFO has a different skill set to a construction CFO. Construction CFO is looking at long-term contracts, blah, blah, blah. Retail CFO is looking at promotions, promotions, mix, different stuff, weekly reporting, etc. So ultimately, you put 2 people in a process like that, the retail CFO is going to get it 10 times out of 10. So why does a construction person even want to entertain that process? Because they're not going to get the job because they know they're up against people.
And that's where the skills-based hiring bit kind of comes into its own, right? Because it disproves the theory that you don't have the skill if you don't have the industry experience. And granted, you're quite right. Actually, that's a really good example of construction versus retail.
Couldn't be more
entirely different skill sets for a CFO. Right? They're still managing, the bottom line. They're still managing investments. They're still managing treasury, whatever it is, and tax. But they are in 2 entirely different environments. One of those people has to probably be quite commercial and look for commercial opportunities like that commercial finance manager type role that emerged in the last 20 years where people didn't just want you to be an accountant anymore, an ACCA first-time passes Big Four background. They wanted you to have some industry experience where you can start business partnering, et cetera, right? The role of an accountant over the years has evolved hugely. It was a numbers role previously, and it didn't really interact with a business in an advisory sense traditionally. Like if you went back to the 70s or 80s, right? It would be like, statistically that might be a good or that might be a poor investment. But these days, finance are on the front line at all sorts of levels. So I think the skills-based hiring bit is pivotal as a change. And it's going to become much easier with AI because with AI, you will pick up on, or you will be able to share your skills and assess people's skills much more easily. And you'll be able to do that in an automated environment.
I just think fundamentally, though, people are risk averse. They revert to type. all the time.
Yeah.
And you will.
100%. So, just like the partners that I met at that 7 stage after all of those interviews, right? You're not changing their minds. They've been in industry for like 25 years. They only know that industry because they've only ever worked in that industry, and anything that's outside of it is a threat, right? They don't understand it, so it's a threat. So I think inclusive hiring talks not only about, I guess, usual kind of demographics and stuff, right? Am I male? Am I female? Am I black? Am I Caucasian? Am I, gay? Am I straight? Whatever. It also talks about diversity of thought and diversity of experience, but it also talks about trying to be more inclusive of ways of working. And it also, by default, in a way of doing that, you're being more inclusive when it comes to socioeconomic kind of backgrounds and stuff, right? So if you remove that university degree qualification requirement, actually there are so many people in the country who are incredibly intelligent who just never had the opportunity to go to university because they had to go to work. I'm of a generation where I knew kids who were in my year at school who were forced by their parents to go out and get a job at 16 because that's just how it was, and they went to the local factory. Super bright, but that was just an old school way that their parents operated. So by just removing things like a degree-based qualification requirement, unless it's job specific, right? If you're an optometrist, you need an optometry degree. But removing it where it's unnecessary increases your inclusivity and makes you, hopefully, inevitably, a more diverse employer.
Exec job searches in 2024, what do they need to be doing? It's a fragmented world.
In what sense? From a search party point of view, or from an individual
I'm looking
point
for
of
my
view?
next finance director, CFO job. Obviously, I'm biased on those functions.
Yeah.
What do you think the people need to be doing these days?
I think they need to get out there. I think the world has gone back to being sociable again. I think it was reluctant in 2022. I think in 2023, you've seen a ramp up, and now in 2024, the art of networking and going to events and going to round tables and being seen and being noticed, I guess, and managing your own brand, right? You see people like Amelia Sordell or whoever on LinkedIn, who I'm a big fan of, and they talk about your personal brand. I think there are two things now. I think there's your profile and then there's your brand. And people who are looking for that next move need to spend time more heavily indexing on the personal brand stuff, because your experience is what your experience is. You've got a CV, you've got a LinkedIn profile, not much more you can do about that. The search firms will either find you for a job if they're looking, you can have your profile open to recruiters, whatever. But actually, unless you're proactively out in the market doing your personal brand stuff, you're not as visible. So many different opportunities have come to me in the last year. I didn't start posting on LinkedIn because I wanted attention or clicks. I don't give a shit. I don't really care. I did it because I have a subject matter expertise, which is probably inch wide, mile deep on a specific subject, which is recruiting and talent acquisition. And I had stuff to say and I had the time to do it. So I started posting. And when I started posting, it might only get 200 or 300 views. And then all of a sudden, some views started going up to 5,000 and then up to 10,000. And then, oh, wow, that one got 75,000. And you're like, oh, I've got a voice here and people want to hear it. And it builds your kind of your personal brand and your identity. And people start to, I walk into round tables now, and when I'm introducing myself, people know who I am because of the content that I've put on LinkedIn. Not because they think, oh my God, oh, it's David. It doesn't work like that. Being a LinkedIn influencer is probably the lowest form of influencer, right?
You don't get paid.
Because you're not getting paid for it. It's not like you're on Instagram or TikTok or something where you're like, oh, I've got 250,000 followers. And I'm, all of a sudden, check me out, I'm being paid £10,000 a post. No, it doesn't really work like that. So I recognized quite early on when I was posting content on LinkedIn that actually, do you know what? This is my marketplace. This is me going to the marketplace, and I'm sharing stories about me and my journey and where I am. And I'm just finishing this assignment. I'm about to start this new assignment. People know what I'm doing and where I am and what I'm up to. And that then led to, David would like to invite you into the Talent 100 thing. And then it's like, oh, we want you on our podcast, or we want you to do this, or can you write a blog for us? Or, you know, certain people like, there's a guy called James Hudson who I follow, who is a LinkedIn recruitment influencer, if you want to call it that, right? James gets 10 times the views that I do. Like, he'll get 1 million views on a post, one post. And he's really gifted. And that for him has led to some wonderful things. He's now writing for Forbes.
Really?
Yeah, he's writing like the recruitment articles and stuff for Forbes. Would that have happened just because he was the head of recruitment for Nike or for Levi's or whoever it is? I hope I've got those companies right. I'm not sure. Levi's definitely. But would that have happened if he wasn't present? No. So I think opportunity comes to those who kind of put themselves out there. So there's the element of, I'm open, I'm in discussion with the Stoics of the world or the Heidrichs or the whoever's, and I'm making myself known that I'm available and I'm interested. And then there's the outreach, because that's the incoming, if you want to look at it that way. And then there's the outreach, and the outreach kind of goes, here's who I am, here's my proposition, here's my brand, here's what I do. Follow me. I'll share content. You then get to kind of buy into me and see who I am a little bit before you then reach out to me and say, oh, well, actually, you know, we're just doing the 50 top talent leaders in the world. Would you be interested in being interviewed and being in it? Well, yes, please, I would. Yeah. Because that essentially puts me on the shopping list of some companies who are then out there looking for their next TA director. Yeah. And that's why.
It's such a change in mindset as well, isn't it? Because you used to have people that would kind of phone people, have their little black book, kind of talk to the same people. And now you've got this amazing opportunity to just share stuff, get noticed. And
well, that's why Michael Page were always so successful, right? When I first got into recruitment, Michael Page were the company that if you wanted to work for one of the big companies, not the Shrek firms, because they were obviously around at the same time, right? But if you were working in contingency or retained recruitment, Michael Page were the standard. Yeah. And it was because of their little black book. And that all changed when LinkedIn came along. Because when LinkedIn came along, that little black book became a massive book that everybody's got access to if they pay for it, right? And it changed the game. Yeah. And 20 years ago, before the advent of, you know, social media and that kind of stuff, you wouldn't get a reputation as a thought leader in an industry unless you were published or you wrote an article in Recruiter magazine or in the CIPD or Change Board or whatever it might be. These days, some of the biggest TA influencers that are out there are recruiters that are 4 years into their career. They've never worked in leadership. They've never written a strategy in their life, but they're just shit hot recruiters. And they've built themselves these incredible personal brands. You know, there's a couple of people out there who I could name that they've got like little nuanced focuses. So one of the guys that I really like focuses on his ADHD, right? And how to work with him and how he works with others and how it affects his day-to-day life. But he's also a recruiter and he's great at it and he loves it. And he's recognized in the recruitment circles, but also then in the neurodiverse kind of circles as a bit of an influencer. People have different angles. My angle is I only talk about TA. I only talk about recruitment. I'm not interested in anything political or anything kind of beyond that. I don't talk about stuff that is outside of my sphere of influence or interest or expertise, because what's the point? I don't bring anything to that discussion. Yeah. So I kind of stay inch wide, mile deep. And
fun question for you.
Go on then.
Dave Brammer gets to every post, 100,000 audience. Would you take on sponsorship? Someone said to you, hi, Dave Brammer, sponsored by Greenhouse.
Do you know what? That actually already happens.
Did it?
Yeah.
And it does now? Okay.
Yeah, I haven't.
People do though, right?
Oh, people do, yeah. I was talking to a friend of mine the other day. He's got half the number of followers that I've got. He got half the amount of reach and doesn't get as much on his content as I do. But he was being paid 150 quid a post over 6 posts by a tech firm.
So it is coming. You know, we are seeing it starting to shift towards a Instagram mentality, and
100%. Yeah. And I think
LinkedIn are gearing up for this as well. I've seen some stuff where you can link into if the video is sponsored. So I feel like it's heading in that direction more and more and more.
Well, Instagram got to that point, didn't it, where people had to start disclosing if it was an advert or not. And I think that was partially driven by HMRC, because they wanted to make sure that they were cracking down on how people were earning their money and that they were paying their tax. But with LinkedIn, I can absolutely see it happening, that someone like a James Hudson, who is so influential and is so brilliant at what he does and writes amazing content, why wouldn't you want to pay him at 1 million views, right? Why wouldn't you want to pay him to promote your ATS or your search firm or whatever it is? Because that platform, day in, day out, is a kind of a go-to for people. I follow as many people as follow me, right? I follow loads and loads of people, typically, again, within the recruitment and TA space, but also broader talent, L&D, HR, whatever, because I just find it interesting. And if you think about like people like Josh Bursin, or if you think in the TA realms of people like Hung Lee or Adam Gordon or whatever, they've got a product that they can sell, and their product is their opinion and it's their experience, and then they can leverage that on behalf of companies. So I do see it coming. I haven't been approached yet. I am open to it.
Who would you, apart from Stoics, obviously, who would you be open to? Who would be your brand go-to?
I don't know. I think if it was
Fender.
Yeah. So I think if it was, I think it's different, right? So you have to be able to remain objective, right? I don't think in an ethical sense that I could just say, right, well, it's an agency, and therefore I'm going to put out some sponsored content by this agency, because
That was a quick rejection, basically.
well, I just think it would discredit a little bit what I do.
Yeah,
If
exactly.
you know what I mean.
Completely
And it would take away the objectivity, and it would take away the impartiality of it all. Whereas actually, if it's a system that I happen to be using in a current company, right? So say I'm working for a company and their ATS is Workday, and Workday said, well, you're working with Workday, and we would like you to do a sponsored post about your experience of working with Workday and, you know, say some positive things about it. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all, because you're doing it from a position of experience rather than just being a mercenary and selling your time to the highest
You didn't get
bid.
asked to do the Workday Rockstar TV ad campaign that they had.
No. Is that a real thing?
Did you not see that one?
Oh my God, that's a real thing?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
It was
no.
on TV for a while. Did you
Yeah,
not
I
see
saw
it?
it.
I would not have been on TV.
Who was on it? Was Ozzy not on it?
Osborne?
A guy from Kiss. They got some big rock stars in it.
Workday
Yeah.
got Ozzy Osbourne.
Well, after
And
this,
one of the
we'll have to
guys
have a little look on
you
YouTube.
have to show me, mate, because
Oh, yeah.
that's unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good ad actually.
I bet it's kick-ass. I mean,
Yeah,
if you look at some of the Uber Eats stuff that they're doing now
Yeah.
with the Beckhams and different people, have you seen any of those yet for the halftime show?
Yeah.
Some of those ads are looking
Yeah.
epic, by the way, right? I get it. And I think it's the right thing. And I think at some point, some of the bigger players like the SAPs for Success Factors or Workday or whoever it is will start to pay recruitment influencers to start talking about their ATS and their platforms and their experiences of it. And I think that would be a great thing. People haven't approached me as yet. I think I would have to do it from a position of experience rather than just being a paid gun.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that adds any value to anybody. And it doesn't feel particularly high integrity to me.
Bringing it back from us, who are obviously LinkedIn junkies.
Yeah, we are a bit, aren't we? But it's an industry thing. So if you work in recruitment broadly or talent acquisition and you're not
And it's,
living on
it's a
LinkedIn.
6-figure contract for us as a business, 3 years. We're not
7
a
figures
big,
for most internal
there you go.
employers, yeah.
But it's chunky. But bringing it back to the average job seeker, and especially for us as well, CFOs, finance directors, not always the best networkers, not putting themselves out there, not marketeers. The thought of putting stuff on LinkedIn is, it's got an ick factor to it. And we've been running a few workshops getting people to it. It's just that subliminal marketing note and standing out. And if we say 150K exec level, that now running from a 30-year-old to a 65-year-old, all pitching in that, often in that same space in the mid-market, 150, 250K for a CFO finance director role. The ability to stand out by putting, just having your name out there, showing up to the many boutiques, particularly if you're an interim operator rather than being found on a search, just being seen and memorable and going, oh, actually, do you know what? I'm going to call David today because funny enough, serendipity and luck has it. I've had an interim job come up yesterday. And you've reminded me that you worked at Dyson that time.
It's so powerful. It really is so powerful. So if I shared a post about how I'd just finished my assignment with Dyson, right, like a week ago. And therefore, I'm doing a bunch of different stuff. I've got my own tech platform. I've got this, I've got that, I've got the other. I'm doing bits of consulting for different people. But I would consider myself open to my next contract, right? And I made that clear in a post. When people are now sharing posts saying, oh, we're looking for a global head of TA, or we're looking for this TA director, whatever it is, people are now tagging me in those posts and saying, David, is this one for you? Are you interested? And 9 times out of 10, I'm not. But the intent and that action only came from the fact that they've seen me visibly managing my time and my brand and reach on LinkedIn. So if you're going to do that, you're going to kind of get what comes back from it, I guess.
But maybe
you
avoid ChatGTP thought leadership, where you haven't changed the Zs, you haven't done anything to it.
Do you know what?
It's hard to cut through all that at the moment. It's a sea of it.
I did a post the other day, and I actually wrote on this post, the LinkedIn AI rewrite wrote this post. And I got it to rewrite my post. And then I wrote like a little, disclaimer at the bottom or whatever. And people were like, did they though? Or not? Did it write it for you? Or, and I was like, well, yeah, because I use lots of dots and stuff, because I don't consider myself to be an English scholar, right? I did all right, got a B and an A in GCSE, I did all right. But, the way that I write is not typical of other kind of business leaders and stuff. And it can't emulate that. It can, if you feed it enough of your content, it will start to read your linguistic style and how you craft the written word. But with LinkedIn, I don't know if it takes that into account, because it didn't sound like me. It didn't sound like me at all. And it sounded kind of corporate spiely. And I didn't really like it. And I'm obviously not going to use it again. But it's an experience, right? And you use it and you see how it goes. But it's I think the evolution of AI is going to continue to play a bigger and bigger role, right? People who are thinking that AI bots are cutting them out at the start of an application process. No, that's not true. No. That doesn't exist, to my knowledge. There may well be a product out there that does that, but I don't know of it if there is. That's still a human thing. So you're being rejected by humans. And when it comes to things like, so Adam Gordon's just launched his new platform, which is called Poetry, which is about recruiter enablement. And it's a bunch of different tools. And I reviewed it for him last week, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was great bit of kit. It will help you to develop bits of content that you can then push out on socials and stuff, right? So you could take a clip of something like this and, push it out. And you can put in, well, here's my topic. My topic is AI use of in finance in this industry and the effects of that. And it will generate you a nice little post, and you can push it out on a Tuesday morning at 10:30. And it'll do that type of stuff for you. What it can't do right now is it can't look someone in the eye of an interview and kind of say, do we have chemistry? Right?
Yeah.
How well is our conversation flowing? Do I think, not that fit is a word that we want to use, right? But how do I think culturally you're going to add something to this business, or what are you going to bring to this business? Because in a written sense, it can rewrite something for you, but it can't read character. It can't, do that type of stuff yet. Maybe some of the Elon stuff can, but it's not out yet. And it's certainly not in recruitment.
I guess when there's this model as well, isn't there? If someone has using a product like a Poetry or any of the others that are out there, you can tell it what you want. And so you can create a perception that you're an expert. But when you meet someone, you absolutely haven't got a clue what you're talking about.
Well, exactly. So, and this is the problem also with like TikTok and stuff, right? So I'm going to start exploring TikTok a little bit, because I just kind of figured, why not?
I can't wait to see that. Are you going to dance?
TikTok for TA?
Oh, no.
TikTok for branding?
TikTok for TA, not
dancing.
get ready with me type stuff. Although I could do the get ready with me type stuff. I don't know. We'll see. But no, the idea is I wanted to see if there was a bit of a recruitment kind of market, right, on TikTok, and whether that is something that people would actually subscribe to and be interested in. But with that kind of stuff, you're basically catfishing a little bit, because I had a look at it yesterday. I started my account and I had a look at it, and I've put this filter on, and all of a sudden my teeth are whiter, my complexion's clearer, my eyes are slightly bluer and slightly bigger, and you're like, oh, check out this guy. Like, I can get involved with this guy. I like this guy. But you're catfishing ultimately, right? As you can be with written word, because you're hiding behind a keyboard warriors, as I call it, right? And there are lots of people who don't post on LinkedIn, and all they do is they fish around for other people's content and then try and just adversely, kind of write, the antithesis of whatever you've put in your post. They'll just argue the opposite. Keyboard warriors. I don't think you can do that in person too much. But I think you soon get found out at an interview. If all your content in your CV is fantastic, but then actually you go to an interview for a finance director role, for example, and you find out that you've got no influencing skills and you've got zero presence or charisma, that's not necessarily going to come across, is it, in the written word? So yeah, AI I think is going to be an interesting one. We'll see what happens. It's going to evolve quick in the TA space. And I do mean like super quick. But let's see. It's not there yet, certainly. And for anybody who is thinking that they're being ruled out of a job by AI, very unlikely.
So anything else you're listening to or reading at the moment that's...
Listening to... nothing really of note. I'm kind of, they say that you don't discover as much music past the age of 35. I would disagree with that. But I did just pick up Breeders' tickets. I think I texted you about that the other night. I picked up some Breeders' tickets at the Troxy later in the year. They're doing the 30th anniversary of the last Splash album, which is going to be mega. And I did also reluctantly just agree to go to a Sepultura farewell gig.
Goodness.
Yeah, with my mate Mark, who is going to the... He's not into the Breeders, and I'm not really into Sepultura, but we tend to go to gigs together. You saw us, we were at Foals, right? Alexandra Palace. That was a good gig.
Yeah.
And we tend to go to gigs together. So he's coming to Breeders with me, even though he's not into them. And then I'm going to go to Sepultura and basically get thrown about for about an hour and a half, because that's going to be a wild one.
Yeah.
Don't wear your best trainers or your best top to that one. I made that mistake with Foals. I went in a brand new pair of trainers that had just cost me an absolute fortune, and they got destroyed at that gig.
Yeah.
Great gig, though.
Final question, because I think we're nearly out of time.
Yeah.
What else have you said yes to recently?
So I'm doing another podcast. So yesterday I agreed to doing a different one, and then obviously Neil texted me last night and said, "Any chance you're free?" And I was like, actually, I'm so free. Yeah, I'm doing another podcast in the next week or so. I'm writing a couple of blogs for a couple of people, doing some consulting work with a couple of different companies, advisory type stuff. But no, nothing really of major note. I went to a breakfast this morning. I was saying to Neil before we walked in, I was kind of like, some of the breakfasts that you can go to are really kick-ass, right? You can go to a round table and it's like the Charlotte Street Hotel and it's really nice. Or you can go, I went to one once at the Ivy, and I went to a lunch once at the Bulgari Hotel. And that must have cost like tens of thousands, right? It's really nice. You can tell if your canapes have got like king prawn in it, that they've spent some decent budget on it. And then conversely, you can go to some and they're in an office and they just go out and do a coffee run. But if it's always about the content, right? So you can go to one of those.
Could be in a cold room in Brick Lane.
You could be in a cold room in Brick Lane with an occasional door banging or a phone going off or whatever. But it's always about the content. So if you're going to turn up to that type of stuff, actually saying yes is a really good thing, because you might say yes and go, oh, I don't know why I'm bothering going to that. And they end up being the ones that are really cool. It's like that night out dichotomy, right? You kind of, I'm really looking forward to that night out. And then it ends up being absolute shit. Whereas you go, I can't be bothered to go out tonight. And then you go and you have like the best night of your life and you're crawling home at like 7 o'clock in the morning. And it can be one of those kind of nights. Saying yes to stuff is good because you learn what stuff tends to be good and what doesn't. But I'm going to keep saying yes to stuff, especially while I've got the time, because why not, right? I went to a breakfast this morning. I met 4 new people that I hadn't met before at that breakfast, all of whom do what I do in the industry that I do it in. And I enjoyed meeting them, and I've extended my network or relevant network as a result of that. You can pick up 1,000 new followers on LinkedIn who you might never meet. right? And you may never learn anything from them. And you can kind of question, well, I can have 1,000 followers who can and will message me at any one time, and we may learn from each other, and they may learn from me, and I may learn from them. But I've met 4 people in person this morning just by getting on a train and going into Farringdon, right? That actually I could end up doing stuff with in the future. So I'm going to keep saying yes, and we'll see what happens until I run out of time to say yes. And once I've run out of time to say yes, that's a good thing, because that means
then
I'm
you get into Neil's position
busy.
of saying no all the time.
I think. Look, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we did that thing together in. I went to the St Albans thing because we're both from a similar area, right? And we went to this thing, and it's great because you network with loads of people from that area. And you meet people, and you've probably walked past them in the high street like 100 times and you just didn't know who they were or what they did. And it turns out that they're the head of TA from TikTok or, from wherever. And that kind of stuff's cool. But it's all proof of concept. You go along. If it's absolute rubbish, you just don't do it again. And that's when you say no. You say no the next time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm going to keep saying yes for the time being.
Well, thank you for joining us. Hopefully this has been one of those things that you thought would be shit, but has actually been really good.
It's been purely cathartic. I've really loved it.